Thank you for inviting me to present at the second real-world evidence conference that you're holding. I'm here to talk about our real-world evidence transparency initiative, mostly, and a couple of related efforts. And I'm trying to forward my slides. So what I'll be talking about is, I'll start with a little bit of background around why we need transparency, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but it also sets the stage. And then I'll talk more specifically about our transparency initiative and what we've been doing lately. We also are working with the International Society for Pharmacoepidemiology in a joint task force on a study, creating a real-world evidence study protocol template. And we have a few other plans. So there we go. This is what I've just described. So let me start with the background that I promised. Many of you are probably familiar with this. About 5 years ago, we felt there was a need to advance the science of real-world evidence in a couple of areas. And we joined forces with ISPOR, the International Society for Pharmacoepidemiology, to do two task force reports. One was on the transparency of study processes, and the other was on the reproducibility of study implementation. In general, ISPOR led the transparency task force, and ISPI led the reproducibility task force, but we worked with each other on both reports. These were published in 2017. Following that, we had a longer discussion about what was the most important initiative to pursue. And we felt that on ISPOR side, study transparency was a real barrier to real-world evidence being seen as high-quality evidence. Transparency is not alone going to guarantee that a study is highly credible. The credibility also depends on the data and the methods and the ability to reproduce the study. But without transparency, the quality is questionable, because the process of getting to the results that are published can be questioned. So we felt it was important to encourage a culture of transparency for those studies that needed to be the most credible and used for decision making, and to establish confidence in this kind of research. So we focused on what is normally called confirmatory studies, where one is seeking to test a hypothesis and have the results held to a high standard of rigor with valid p-values. We know that this is probably not the majority of real-world evidence work. A lot of real-world evidence work is used in the context of discovery, to generate hypotheses, to understand the data, to minimize false negatives, and that's perfectly legitimate work. But in that course of that, usually the p-values don't mean much. And so it's hard to draw conclusions from that work for decision making. So pre-registration can be a point at which one establishes that you have created a study hypothesis before you look at the data, and therefore the p-values should be more interpretable. Presenting exploratory work results as confirmatory may increase their publishability, but it's at the expense of its credibility. To pursue this effort, we pulled together a number of stakeholders. And you can see here from all sectors, it was largely Western-based, that's true. But ISPI and ISPOR are global societies. We also joined forces with the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy here in the US and the National Pharmaceutical Council, which importantly represents a lot of the biopharmaceutical firms. to decide on exactly how we wanted to proceed. But we did have regulatory agencies, HTA agencies, other registries, consulting companies, patients involved in this. We decided we would focus on secondary data use studies. That is, data studies that are using data that were not originally collected for this particular research purpose. So we're talking mostly about administrative claims data or electronic health record data or secondary analysis of registry data, other types of prospective observations. There are challenges here. Data quality is a major challenge in many of these databases, and that's foremost in the minds, in fact, of many regulators. There are certainly concerns around data dredging, p-hacking, cherry picking, that is going through a lot of analyses and picking the result for the purposes of publication. That's a major concern, of course. Often studies are not transparent about their original research questions, their objectives, how they created their data set and so forth. Often results are not reported, and that decreases our ability to look at the universe of studies, just as we're now getting better at being able to look at the universe of clinical trial data. This focus on confirmatory studies, we actually call it hypothesis evaluating treatment effect studies that are intended for regulatory, payer, or other decision-making use, and for publication, that evaluates the presence or absence of a pre-specified treatment effect or its magnitude, and tests specific hypothesis in a specific data set. And when used in conjunction with other evidence, may lead to treatment recommendations. And this is what we try to do in our field, is to affect treatment in a well-informed way. We published, having worked with a set of people from this initiative, we published our results, our recommendations in Value in Health about a year ago. And briefly, the recommendations include identifying a site to register your secondary data use PEAT studies, briefly we call them PEAT. Determine the characteristics of what goes into that registration and provide incentives. Why should you do this? Provide incentives for routine registration of PEAT studies. Now, there are registries out there where you can register your real-world data studies. Two major ones are clinicaltrials.gov and the European Medicine Agency EU PASS registry, which is meant for post-authorization safety studies. That's what PASS stands for. These are both oriented in the kinds of questions that are asked for studies with prospective data collection. And they both fulfill specific regulatory requirements. They are certainly excellent places to register a real-world data study if that's where you want it to be. But they do take longer to do, and there are some questions in there that aren't exactly fit for purpose for secondary data use studies. And we felt it was important to have a fairly easy to use registry for real-world evidence PEAT studies based on secondary data use. So we created one. We worked with our group. We worked with another group, an existing group called the Center for Open Science, whose mission is to increase openness, integrity, and reproducibility of research. It works across all the spectrum of sciences, not just health economics, to provide a place where open source science can be done. One of the things it does is it houses the Open Science Forum Registries, which is a scholarly repository built for sharing, searching, and aggregating registrations of research. This is their main website. Within that, we created a specific registry we called the Real World Evidence Registry. And it consists of 6 or 7 screens for entering data that detail your study protocol. Again, these are meant for the hypothesis evaluating treatment effect studies with secondary data use. There is a referenceable URL in DOI. You can store things here if you want. As you register your study, you're asked about a number of study characteristics. At the end, you must upload a protocol, usually a PDF protocol. We've had this up since the beginning of the year. We've made a couple of refinements. We call this version 2.0 right now. This is the first page. It steps you through the things you need to do to register the protocol. It may take, if you have a study protocol in hand, it probably takes 30 minutes the first time, less once you're familiar with it. So it's open for business. We have registrations in there now. There is a user guide available on the first page that you can download at the registry site. We are working at this very minute on how-to videos that will be available in a month or 2. We have gotten agreement from Value and Health that manuscripts based on pre-registered worldwide evidence study protocols will receive expedited review at Value and Health. We're working on with other journals for other incentives as well. And here's your, here again is the link. One thing I should mention is that one of the elements of the registration is a question that asks you to attest to the point of study progress you are when you register. That is, have you collected your data, or have you abstracted your data? Have you looked at sample sizes? Have you started analysis of treatment versus outcomes? A big thing is to try to register before you look at the association of treatment and outcomes. So you basically haven't peeked at the result before you establish your hypothesis. So that's the basic information about our registry. We are open to anybody who wants to register. When you put your study in there, there is a moderator to ensure that you've done a complete registration. Once that is confirmed, your study will be posted. You had the option to hide the study, we call it embargo, the protocol, if you want to keep it confidential for a while. This is not uncommon for proprietary studies. Your protocol is, we call it date stamped. So at the time you register, it is established as having been registered, but no one else except specific people you may identify can see it until a date when you say it is open to the public. That it allows for the confidentiality while having it established that you did pre-register your study. So I encourage you to use it. I'm certainly open for questions if you have any.